Respected Speaker, thank you for granting this House the opportunity to discuss a topic that has undoubtedly attained singular importance in the national consciousness, the widespread impact of COVID-19, and specifically to lay bare this government's mismanagement of this crisis. I've taken my own mask off to speak, sir, as I try and unmask this government. वैसे इस बीमारी की वजह से सरकार के लिए एक बात अच्छी हो गई, उसे मुंह छुपाने की बहाना मिल गया. But in any case, yesterday, September 19th, based on data of the World Health Organization, WHO, India recorded a fresh set of 93,337 cases compared to 42,000 in the USA, and tragically additional deaths of 2,247 compared to 800 and something in the USA, effectively making us the country with the highest number of daily cases and deaths globally. It is a painful reflection of the grim times we live in, and equally a reminder of how important it is for us to take time and discuss this vital issue in this House. Just as there are rules and conventions that guide the functioning of this august House, sir, a set of principles and systems that are adhered to under your leadership and supervision, as you often remind us, Mr. Speaker, so too in any democratic country there is an age-old contract between the citizen and the government, which rides on certain fundamental expectations: the transparent functioning of the government, the upholding of inalienable rights, the access to basic resources to sustain an empowered life, the sound management of our economy through competent policy making, a participative and democratic decision-making process, and above all, the conviction and capability of an elected government to ensure that the safety and security of individual citizens is never compromised. This context is important for all of us who have gathered here to recognize, because we must understand the scale of the breathtaking violations of this basic compact by our government during the last 6 months. The situation precipitated by the COVID-19 pandemic was certainly extraordinary in terms of its rampant spread and impact across all walks of life. However, sir, it must be said that such a situation of distress and vulnerability is precisely where our citizens would expect their government to reaffirm the special contract that holds us together. But instead of mature and proactive governance, we've collectively witnessed a fundamental breakdown in government machinery these past few months. Instead of clearly communicated protocols and comprehensive strategies, we have collectively witnessed an alarming lack of clarity, readiness, and preparedness to tackle this virus. And above all, where the citizens of the country expected their government to lead them out of this darkness, we have sadly witnessed an unconscionable betrayal of the concerns and aspirations of the people by the very government they elected. Respected Speaker, let us look at how things unraveled in the last 6 months. As early as January, there were compelling indications that the virus that had originated in Wuhan was far more complex and potentially devastating than we had earlier imagined. By January 30, the World Health Organization had declared the COVID-19 virus as a public health emergency, a declaration that came on the same day that India too had its first documented case in the form of a student who had returned to Kerala from Wuhan. When this government failed to produce any tangible reaction to these developments, on February 12th, my colleague and member of this House, Shri Rahul Gandhi, tweeted and publicly warned the ruling dispensation, I quote, "The coronavirus is an extremely serious threat to our people and our economy. My sense is the government is not taking this threat seriously. Timely action is critical," unquote. When the government ignored this to host a crowded welcome to President Trump in Ahmedabad, Congress followed up with exhortations on March 3rd and 5th, which I'm sorry to say were ignored by the government that has routinely prioritized partisan policies over constructive dialogue. Had they listened to Rahul Gandhi's prescient warnings and those of others like him, surely the situation could have been managed better. Instead, driven by what appeared to be greater interest in toppling a state government in Madhya Pradesh rather than national priorities, the present ruling dispensation continued to delay the implementation of a national strategy to clamp down on the spread of the virus. This, respected Chairman, was the first failure of this government. I'll mention 5 in due course. A failure to adequately recognize the scale and complexity of the problem we were dealing with, compounded by an unwillingness to listen to voices that warned us well in advance of the consequences of ignoring a problem of such magnitude. Still, given at that point the number of cases were comparatively low in India, there was still time for the government to execute a well-thought-out and comprehensive strategy to curb the virus. While experts may differ on details of lockdown strategies, they're all unanimous in their opinion that sufficient notice and advance warning are critical for a successful lockdown. Advance warning would have given critical time for our medical systems and frontline healthcare workers to prepare for an onslaught of cases. Advance warning would have given time for those who were at that point overseas to make it back to the country and prepare to hunker down. Advance warning would have allowed those within the country, particularly economically vulnerable groups like our migrant workers, sufficient time to make it back to their respective home states where they would have had necessary support systems to look after themselves. But perhaps above all, surely the provision of advance warning and transparent announcements is a basic courtesy that any government should have extended to the people of our country. It's the moral responsibility, after all, of the government to take the nation into confidence, not leave them in the dark. But as we've seen over these last 6 years, this government has a remarkable penchant for shock and awe tactics rather than mature leadership. And just as we witnessed during the sudden announcement of the disastrous decision of demonetization in November 2016, once again this nation was betrayed by the whims and fancies of its leadership. Even though the people of this country were given 3 days' notice before locking down for a mere 17-hour Janta curfew on a Sunday, when most individuals spend a lot of time at home anyway, a trial for a longer national lockdown, what followed was horrific. Riding roughshod over federalism with no pretense of consulting the state governments, on the 24th of March, the PM took to the air to announce a lockdown for 21 days from that midnight. Planes, trains, highways, public transport were to be abruptly shut down 3.5 hours after the PM finished speaking. A shockingly short window to prepare for 3 weeks of staying indoors. Without any serious announcement of what support systems would be in place during the lockdown, it was inevitable that rampant chaos would follow this abrupt decree. And that brings me to the second failure of this government, sir. The creation of a government-made disaster which laid the foundations for widespread distress and anguish that followed. A series of events that should haunt each of us and astonish this government's moral standing. Across the country, we know about the long lines that immediately sprung up outside our kirana shops, shocked citizens queuing up to purchase critical rations to see this period through. Thousands took to our bus depots, our railway stations. People made desperate attempts to make it back to their respective homes. Businessmen and women who had traveled to other cities for meetings were stranded by the PM's high-handed action, and those overseas suddenly were left with no way to return back to the country. And our migrant workers and daily wage workers, besides themselves in their distress, took to the roads and highways in a desperate attempt to make it back to their home states. The very next day, the PM, in his address to residents of his constituency, likened the disaster he had unleashed upon the nation to Kurukshetra. The Mahabharata, he said, took 18 days before victory was earned. Tackling the COVID virus would take 21 days. 180 days have passed, respected Speaker. Our national caseload is the second largest in the world and heading for number 1. Daily cases have nearly reached 1 lakh, higher than any other country. The economy is in tatters, having suffered a contraction far more severe than any other country. And therefore, perhaps the analogy best suited to describe this government is that of Emperor Nero, who played the fiddle while an entire nation burned. Or more accurately, here we have an emperor who resorted to tali bajao and diya jalao while a nation suffered beyond any conceivable measure. हम ये नहीं कहते कि महामारी नहीं थी, हम ये बता रहे हैं कि तैयारी नहीं थी. तैयारी से लड़ते तो हालात न होते. रेल की पटरी पर वो प्रवासी न सोते. साइकिल पे बूढ़े बाप को बेटी नहीं ढोती. लाश पर माँ की कभी बच्ची नहीं रोती. अर्थव्यवस्था इस तरह निपात न होती, शायद हमारी इतनी बुरी मात न होती. विश्व पटल पर हम कभी प्रथम नहीं आते. जितने मरे हैं लोग वो मारे नहीं जाते. अच्छी सी कोई योजना हम रच सकते थे. मिलजुल सलाह करते तो शायद बच सकते थे. हम ये नहीं कहते कि महामारी नहीं थी, हम ये बता रहे हैं कि तैयारी नहीं थी. In a country where, according to most estimates, Nearly 90% of the workforce is employed in the informal economy, where 38 crore Indians out of 47 crore who make up our totally employed workforce are predominantly in jobs that offer a daily wage. Surely this government should have had the foresight to understand the implications of the shock and awe style of governance on the livelihoods of its own citizens. Depending on which set of sources you refer to, the numbers that quantify the scale of the migrant workers' crisis vary. In June, the Chief Labour Commissioner estimated that over 26 lakh migrant workers were stranded in various parts of the country, while others estimate a reverse migration of up to 3 crore workers since mid-March. The image of tens of thousands of our fellow citizens setting off on foot to make it back to their hometowns has been seared into the collective consciousness of our nation. If as little as a direct assurance to such marginalized groups, a clear promise of support followed through with policies to ensure that no worker would go hungry or would lose access to basic income or healthcare, if such had been given, much of the crisis that followed could have been averted. If this sudden announcement and the distress the government caused to our people was to arrest the spread of the virus, then I'm sorry to say the approach was utterly misguided and has completely failed. As highlighted in a letter addressed to the PM that was signed by distinguished medical experts of several national associations, and I quote, "Had the migrant persons been allowed to go home at the beginning of the epidemic when the disease spread was very low, the current situation could have been avoided. The returning migrants are now taking infection to each and every corner of the country, mostly to rural and peri-urban areas in districts with relatively weak public health systems." In other words, the third significant failure of this government is that not only did their high-handedness result in widespread pain for our people, but their role in fomenting such an exceptional displacement of migrant workers actively undermined any gains that were initially envisioned from a national lockdown. As the virus continued to spread, the countermeasures of a lockdown persisted, and this has inevitably laid low our already fragile economy. This is not a debate on the economy, Mr. Speaker, but the fact is that shutting down every productive activity in the name of flattening the curve meant only that, in the words of Rajiv Bajaj, we flattened the wrong curve. COVID rose, but our economy collapsed. All our main indicators are in the red, with no end in sight, causing sleepless nights for most Indians. We've already seen the 23.9% contraction in Q1 GDP, compared to 9.1 in US, 9.7 in Brazil. Most experts have suggested an overall contraction of 10 to 11% is likely to take place in this financial year. Far more worrying is the impact the pandemic has had on the workplace. We, in this House, have seen how many MPs have now been infected, new cases coming in every day. Let us face it, at least we have a job thanks to our voters. We're suffering already record levels of unemployment under this government's watch ahead of the arrival of the virus, but estimates suggest that the situation has further deteriorated, with the Centre for the Monitoring of the Indian Economy pointing out that about 21 million salaried employees lost their jobs during April to August, with about 3.3 million jobs, 33 lakh jobs being lost in August, and 4.8 million, 48 lakhs in July. The total number of salaried jobs in the country at the end of last month stood at 65 million, having come down from 86 million in the previous fiscal year. घर घर में अंधेरा है, कहीं बाहर नहीं है, बैठे हैं युवा खाली, रोजगार नहीं है. Now, admittedly, the global economy has suffered significantly as well, but across the world we've seen instances where governments have actively implemented countermeasures to mitigate the economic devastation of the COVID pandemic. The United Kingdom, for instance, had rolled out a furlough scheme, a coronavirus job retention scheme which encouraged employers not to let go of their workers, 80% of whose salaries would be supported by the government. In other words, the government would pay to ensure that you could keep your job. Our government's announcement of a 20 lakh crore economic relief package has inspired little confidence, particularly when its fine print shows that new fiscal support amounted to only 1.86 lakh crores, less than 1% of the GDP. Much of the package had already been included in the union budget for 2021, or merely facilitates people's own borrowings. As a result, respected Speaker, India has carved a worrying but distinctive position for itself. In their response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the nations of the world have three kinds of report cards. In a handful of cases, they managed to get on top of the virus, and their economy also thrived. The majority of countries, however, manage one or the other. That is, they either managed to mitigate the healthcare effects of the virus at the cost of the economy, or they kept the engine of the economy running while suffering an onslaught of the virus. India, on the other hand, has become a poster child for the worst case scenario. We have the worst of both worlds. We have neither managed to limit the spread of the virus, nor have we managed to keep the economy afloat. The GDP for the first time in 41 years will actually shrink. Our employment crisis has become even worse than before. Small and medium businesses have been devastated. Trade has crashed, and our foreseeable national prospects are dire. In a panicky overreaction to economic failure, the government is unlocking the country even as cases are shooting up. A lockdown imposed when we had 564 cases is being lifted when we are inching towards 54 lakh cases. Or to be precise, 53,08014 as of yesterday. What greater indication can we have, respected Speaker, of the fourth failure of this government? It took 135 days to reach 1 million registered cases, 10 lakhs in the country, 3 weeks after for 20 lakhs, 16 days for 30 lakhs, 13 days for 40 lakhs, and now just 11 days for 50 lakhs or 5 million. At this rate, we will cross 60 lakhs by next week, numbers which offer a sharp indictment of the failure of this government's strategies to curb the transmission of the virus. Most of the challenges we as a nation are confronted by today stem from the manner in which the present ruling dispensation governs. I'm sorry to say there has been minimal effort by the government to reach out and consult with other stakeholders, particularly the state governments and the opposition, before embarking on their flawed plans. As early as May, the Indian National Congress, along with like-minded parties, had come together and offered a series of constructive suggestions to this government, which were invariably ignored at serious cost to our fellow citizens. 11 suggestions were placed before this government, including a direct cash transfer outlined by the Indian National Congress under its Nyay program, which would support distressed communities, free distribution of rations, free transportation for migrant workers, greater consultation with state governments and within Parliament, and a revised and enhanced financial package, a fiscal stimulus, a genuine one. I've no doubt that had the government adopted some of these ideas and consulted with opposition parties, we could have been better placed to mitigate the spread of the virus. Instead, we have the fifth and final failure of this government, a failure to recognize the merits of a deliberative democracy, of not consulting but dictating, of not governing but ruling. और अंत में किसान गरीब के मुद्दे पर सरकार को विशेषण करना चाहता हूं कि ये मुद्दा आप पिछले मुद्दों की तरह टीवी पर कुछ और दिखाकर भटका नहीं सकते, क्योंकि गरीब किसान टीवी नहीं देखते. Anyway, the unfortunate reality today, sir, as I conclude, is of an India where tokenism and lip service have taken precedence over concrete ideas. I'm concluding, sir, in 1 minute. Over concrete ideas and deliberative governance, where no honest effort is made to overhaul the infrastructure deficiencies, despite which our frontline healthcare heroes who worked heroically, even at the cost of their own lives, though the government sadly says it doesn't have any data about this. And through you, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to express the thanks of this House to all the healthcare workers for their services to this nation. It's also in India where students have been forced to risk giving examinations that are vital to their futures at a time when even Parliament, the temple of democracy, may wind up ahead of schedule because of the virus. An India where basic healthcare services, such as immunization programs, have been disrupted, particularly in rural areas. An India where the electoral fates of upcoming state assembly elections have transcended our national priorities. An India where the virus has been used to promote another lockdown, a lockdown on individual liberties and freedoms, as activists who have been arrested under the draconian UAPA have realized. To those in government, let me say that there is still time for you to recognize the follies of your current approach. While thanking all my colleagues in this House for having braved this Mahamari in the service of this Parliament, I urge this government to become more transparent in your functioning, to gather and release data to experts where required, to consult with all stakeholders before acting, and ultimately to take this nation into confidence, because it is losing confidence in you, the government. Sir, through you, sir, I would like to assure the young people of this country that this Parliament will stand with them and their future that we will continue to argue for the best possible practices and policies so we can overcome this crisis. And I hope, sir, that this House will seriously offer suggestions to the government, as I've done in my remarks, that might help it undertake a much-needed course correction. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Jai Hind.